What would you do if the world had taken everything from you, your land, your name, your future, and left you with nothing but the dust on your boots and a single aging horse? For one man, this wasn't a question. It was the cold, hard ground beneath his feet. He was given a choice: carry a stranger, a wounded native woman left for dead, 40 miles into the wilderness, or leave her to the mercy of the elements. He chose to carry her. But what happened next wasn't just about the journey, and it wasn't just about the woman. It was about her horse, a scrawny, forgotten creature with a secret buried deep in its bloodline, a secret that would rewrite the destiny of the entire valley. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, as we tell a story of quiet courage and a debt that could never be repaid with coin. Silas Croft rode into Redemption Gulch with the setting sun at his back, a long shadow stretching out before him like a memory he couldn't outrun. The town was little more than a gash in the landscape, a collection of tired clapboard buildings leaning against a wind that never seemed to stop blowing. He remembered it from before, from a time when his father's name, Croft, meant something in this valley. Now it meant less than nothing. It was a name tied to failure, to a ranch swallowed by debt, and a winter that had taken more than just cattle. His face was a map of hard miles, his coat worn thin at the elbows, and the man underneath was worn thinner still. He dismounted in front of the livery, the hinges groaning a weary welcome. His horse, a gray gelding named Anchor, lowered its head and sighed, the breath pluming in the cooling air. Anchor was all he had left of the old life, a 17-year-old companion with more loyalty in his gentle eyes than Silas had found in most men. He paid the stable boy the last of his real silver for a bag of oats and a stall for the night, keeping the few remaining coins for himself. He wouldn't be staying. His destination lay another day's ride north, a 40-acre plot of high country timber and rock his father had won in a card game 2 decades ago. It was listed on a deed folded in his pocket, a piece of paper everyone, including his father, had considered worthless. A joke. But for Silas, it was the only piece of the world he could still lay claim to. He walked toward the saloon, not for whiskey, but for information. The place smelled of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. Faces turned as he entered, eyes lingering on his worn clothes before dismissing him. He was just another drifter, another ghost haunting the edges of other men's prosperity. He saw Jedediah Thorne holding court at a corner table, the man who now owned the Double C Ranch, the man who owned his home. Thorne was laughing, a loud, booming sound that filled the room. He saw Silas, and the laughter hitched, replaced by a smirk of contempt. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Thorne announced to his table. "Silas Croft, come back to admire my view?" Silas said nothing. He turned to the bar, his jaw set. He just needed to know the condition of the North Trail. The bartender, a man with tired eyes, gave him the information in a low voice, as if doing him a favor. The trail was clear but rough. No one went up there much. It was a dead end. Perfect, Silas thought. A dead end was exactly what he was looking for. He bought a small sack of flour and some salt pork, his final transaction with the world he was leaving behind. He walked back out into the twilight, the laughter from the saloon a physical thing against his back. He had lost his legacy, his name, his place. All he had left was a worthless deed and a long ride into nowhere. The wind picked up, whispering through the alleys of Redemption Gulch, a lonely sound for a lonely man. What he didn't know was that his journey into nowhere was about to lead him somewhere he could never have imagined. The next morning, Silas was packed and mounted before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge. He led anchor toward the edge of town, toward the north trail that climbed into the unforgiving high country. The air was thin and clean, a welcome change from the sour atmosphere of the town. He was just clearing the last of the outlying shacks when anchor suddenly stopped, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. Silas followed the horse's gaze to a shallow creek bed choked with willow and scrub oak. There was a flicker of movement, then stillness. A feeling, cold and sharp, went through him. He dismounted, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard, and walked slowly toward the creek. There, half hidden in the brush, was a woman. She was lying on her side, her dark hair fanned out against the dry earth. She was native, dressed in worn buckskin, and one of her legs was bent at an unnatural angle, the fabric torn and stained dark with blood. A few yards away stood a horse, a dusty Appaloosa mare, its coat a strange pattern of mottled gray and white. It was thin, almost skeletal, but its eyes were fiercely intelligent as it watched Silas approach. It didn't bolt. It simply stood its ground, a silent, defiant guardian. The woman was unconscious, her breathing shallow. Silas knelt, his touch gentle as he checked her pulse. It was weak, thready. She wouldn't last long out here. He looked back toward the town, then up the trail into the wilderness. He had a choice. He could ride back, bring the sheriff, and let the town deal with it. But he knew how Redemption Gulch would deal with it. They would see her as a nuisance, a problem to be ignored until it went away. Or he could do something himself. He was a man with nothing, heading to nowhere. What was one more burden? He made his decision in the quiet of the morning. He carefully lifted the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as fragile as a bird. As he stood, the mare took a step toward him, its gaze unwavering. It watched him, not with fear but with an unnerving sense of appraisal. He carried the woman to his own horse. Anchor stood steady as Silas gently situated her in the saddle, securing her as best he could. He would have to walk. He took Anchor's reins and started the long journey north, the mare following a few paces behind, its hooves making almost no sound on the dusty trail. The 40 miles to his worthless plot of land had just become a pilgrimage. What would you do with a life you didn't ask to save? What secrets does an animal hold when it refuses to leave your side? Let us know in the comments what you think Silas should do next. And if you're enjoying our story, please consider liking and subscribing for more tales from the forgotten corners of the West. Now, as the sun climbed higher, Silas Croft put his head down and walked, one step at a time, into a future he could not yet see. As Silas led his horse, now carrying double, back through the outskirts of Redemption Gulch to get to the main northern trail, he did not go unnoticed. Windows became frames for curious, disapproving faces. Men stopped their work to stare, their expressions a mixture of pity and scorn. They saw a broken man, already burdened by his own failure, now literally carrying the weight of another. Jedediah Thorne was leaving the saloon, his face flushed with morning whiskey, when he saw the small procession. He stopped dead in the street, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He let Silas draw even with him before he spoke, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Taking in strays, Croft?" he called out, gesturing with his cigar at the unconscious woman slumped over Anchor's saddle. First a worthless plot of land, now a worthless squaw. You have a taste for charity, or just for things no one else wants? Silas kept walking, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. He wouldn't give Thorn the satisfaction of a reply. His silence only seemed to fuel the man's contempt. "You'll end up as dirt poor as them," Thorn shouted at his back. "That land will starve you, and she'll thank you by slitting your throat in your sleep." The laughter of Thorn's companions followed Silas as he cleared the last building, a bitter sound that the wind carried and threw back at him. He didn't look back. The town and its judgment were behind him now. Ahead lay only the trail, the woman's life hanging in the balance, and the strange, silent mare that continued to follow. Just as the trail began its steep ascent into the pines, he passed an old prospector panning in a small stream, a man known only as Silas. The old man looked up from his work, his eyes pale and clear as water, seeming to see right through Silas Croft. He didn't speak of the woman or the horse. He simply looked at Silas, then at the vast, indifferent sky. "Some debts," the old man said, his voice like stones grinding together, "are paid in spirit, not in silver." Silas nodded, though he had no idea what the man meant. It was a riddle he had no time to solve. He tipped his hat and continued on, the prospector's words echoing in his mind, another piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was holding. The town's mockery was a fresh wound, a confirmation of his status as an outcast. Thorn saw him as a fool, collecting broken things. The prospector saw something else, something Silas couldn't name. For now, all that mattered was the weight in his saddle and the steady, quiet footsteps of the mare behind him. The sun beat down, and the trail grew steeper. Every step was an act of defiance against the voices that had written him off. He was walking away from a world that had no use for him, and for the first time, he felt he was walking toward something, though he couldn't have said what it was. All he knew was that he had made a choice, and now he had to see it through, no matter the cost. The cryptic warning, or perhaps blessing, from the old man settled in his bones, a quiet hum beneath the rhythm of his own weary footsteps. The journey was a slow, grueling ordeal. The 40 miles stretched into an eternity under the relentless sun. Silas walked, his boots scuffing on rock and kicking up dust. His focus narrowed to the next step, and the one after that. He had given the woman the last of his water, his own thirst a dull ache in the back of his throat. He spoke to Anchor in low, soothing tones, apologizing for the double burden, though the old horse seemed to understand, plodding onward with a stoic endurance that mirrored Silas's own. The mare followed. It was a constant presence at his back, a shadow that moved with an uncanny silence. It never whinnied, never made a sound, but he could feel its eyes on him. When he stopped to rest, it stopped too, always maintaining the same careful distance. It wouldn't let him approach, but it would not be left behind either. He tried to shoo it away once, thinking it might find its way back to its own people, but it only watched him, unmoved, until he gave up and started walking again. It was as if they were tied together by an invisible rope. By the second day, the landscape had changed. The dusty plains gave way to rolling hills thick with pine and aspen. The air grew cooler, cleaner. Silas felt a stirring of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of coming home, even though this land was alien to him. This was the high country his father had spoken of, a place of harsh beauty and solitude. Finally, late in the afternoon, he saw it. A small, cleared meadow on a high bench overlooking a deep canyon. And in the center of the meadow, the cabin. It was more of a shack, really. The roof sagged in the middle, the chimney had a lean, and the single door hung crookedly on one hinge. It was derelict, forgotten, just as the deed had promised. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, rose in his throat. This was his inheritance, a ruin. But then he looked at the woman, her face pale, her breathing still dangerously shallow. The ruin would have to be enough. It was shelter. He gently lifted her from Anchor's back and carried her inside. The cabin was one small room, empty save for a rusted wood stove and a thick layer of dust and leaves. He laid her carefully on the floor in the corner, using his saddle blanket as a mattress and his coat as a pillow. He built a fire in the stove, coaxing a weak flame to life with dry pine needles and twigs. A sliver of warmth began to push back the chill. He went back outside to tend to the horses. Anchor drank deeply from a nearby stream, but the mare stood apart, its head raised, sniffing the air. It watched the cabin, its strange spotted coat almost glowing in the fading light of dusk. That night, Silas slept on the hard floor near the door, his rifle beside him. He drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep, his dreams filled with the whispers of the town and the weight of the woman's life in his hands. Sometime near midnight, he woke to a sound. It was a soft nickering from just outside the door. He sat up, his heart pounding. He peered through a crack in the wall. It was the mare. It was standing vigil, its silhouette a stark shape against the star-dusted sky. It hadn't left. It was guarding the cabin, guarding the woman. And for some reason he couldn't explain, it felt like it was guarding him too. He lay back down, the hard floor seeming a little less cold. The disappointment he'd felt upon arrival was slowly being replaced by something else. A quiet sense of purpose. He was here. He had a fire, a roof, and 2 lives, one human and one animal, that depended on him. It wasn't the life he'd lost, but it was a life nonetheless. And in the deep silence of the high country, that felt like a start. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Silas fell into a rhythm of survival. His first priority was the woman. He cleaned and bound her wound as best he could, using boiled water and strips torn from his spare shirt. He foraged for edible roots and berries he recognized from his youth on the ranch, making a thin, hot broth which he patiently spooned between her lips. She remained unconscious, lost in a fevered state, occasionally murmuring words in a language he did not recognize. Her life was a flickering candle flame he shielded with his own hands against the wind. His second task was the cabin. He worked from dawn until dusk, his hands already calloused, growing tougher still. He patched the roof with shingles split from a fallen pine, chinked the walls with mud and moss, and rehung the door so it closed snug against the night. He was not just repairing a shelter, he was building a sanctuary. Through it all, the mare remained. She was a constant, quiet observer. She would graze at the edge of the meadow, but her eyes were always on the cabin, on Silas. He named her Pathfinder in his mind, for no reason he could articulate. It just seemed to fit. She was different from any horse he had ever known. She moved with a purpose, an intelligence that was almost human. She never came close enough to touch, but she was never far enough to lose sight of. One evening, as he was rubbing down Anchor after a long day of hauling timber, he noticed something. He was watching Pathfinder as she drank from the stream, the setting sun catching her flank. There, half hidden by her dusty winter coat, was a mark. It wasn't a brand like the ones used by ranchers, no lazy S or rocking C. This was a symbol, intricate and precise. It looked like a spiral with 3 lines radiating from the center, like the legs of a water spider. He had never seen anything like it. It was too deliberate for a scar, too fine for a cattle brand. It was a message he could not read. He tried to get a closer look, but as he took a step toward her, she lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting his, and took a deliberate step away. The message was clear. Look, but do not touch. He let it be. He didn't push. He returned to his work, but the image of the symbol was burned into his mind. It was a small detail, a thing that did not fit. A horse from a native tribe, yes, but this was something more. Ranchers branded for ownership. This felt different. It felt like it signified a purpose, a role, a name. The woman murmured in her sleep, a single word repeated over and over. Nima. He began to call her that, whispering it as he tended to her. Nima. The fever had to break soon, or he would lose her. That night, a frost settled on the meadow, the first real bite of the coming autumn. He sat by the fire, watching Nima's chest rise and fall. The symbol on the horse, the strange, knowing intelligence in its eyes, the woman's unknown past, it all swirled in his mind. He was a man who had sought a dead end, a place to be forgotten. Instead, he had found a place filled with questions. He looked out the small, newly glazed window. Pathfinder was there, a pale ghost in the moonlight, her head bowed against the cold. She hadn't sought the shelter of the trees. She stood in the open, facing the cabin, a sentinel on duty. The mystery of her presence was a weight as real as the responsibility he felt for the woman inside. The first week turned into a second. The rhythm of labor became Silas's entire existence. Every swing of the axe, every stone he moved to clear a small patch of ground for a garden, was a prayer against the helplessness he felt. He worked until his muscles screamed and his mind was too tired for the ghosts of his past to find purchase. He was mending more than just a cabin. He was mending himself, piece by painful piece. Anchor, his faithful old gelding, worked alongside him, hauling logs and pulling stumps with a steady, uncomplaining strength that shamed Silas's own moments of despair. The horse was a living link to his father, to a life of purpose, and his presence was a quiet comfort in the vast wilderness. Nima's fever finally broke on the 9th day. He awoke one morning to find her eyes open, lucid and aware for the first time. They were dark and deep, and they held a fear that was quickly replaced by a cautious curiosity. He offered her water, and she drank, her hand trembling as she held the tin cup. They had no common language. Communication was a slow, deliberate dance of gestures and expressions. He would point to himself and say his name, Silas. She would watch his lips, and after a few days, she whispered her own, Nima. It was the word from her fever dreams. Her name was Moon. He learned that her leg was broken, not just sprained, and he reset the crude splint with more care, his hands gentle. She bore the pain with a stoicism that humbled him. During this time, his connection with the mare, Pathfinder, deepened in its own silent way. The horse had begun to act as his guide. One afternoon, the stream near the cabin ran low. He was worrying about a reliable water source for the winter when Pathfinder, who had been watching him, turned and began walking deliberately toward a dense copse of aspens on the far side of the meadow. She stopped and stomped her hoof once, then looked back at him. It was a clear invitation. He followed, intrigued. She led him to a place where the ground was soft and green, though it hadn't rained in weeks. He dug with his hands, and then with a shovel, and not 3 feet down, he hit clear, cold water. A hidden spring. It was a gift, a miracle that would ensure their survival. Another time, she led him away from a patch of mushrooms he'd been about to gather, nudging his hand away with her nose. Later, he found one of the same mushrooms in a book on plants he'd inherited, marked clearly as poisonous. The horse was not just an animal, she was a partner. His hands were learning the truth of this place through labor, but the horse was teaching him its secrets. He started talking to her, telling her about his day, about his worries for Nima, about the ranch he'd lost. She would listen, her ears swiveling to catch his words, her soft eyes seeming to understand. One evening, Nima was strong enough to sit up by the fire. She watched Silas as he carved a piece of wood. She pointed to the window, then made a gesture like a horse galloping. He understood. She was asking about her mare. He nodded and gestured that the horse was safe, that she was just outside. A look of profound relief crossed her face. Then, she picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a flat piece of pine bark. Slowly, carefully, her hands still weak, she began to draw. It wasn't a picture of the cabin or the mountains. It was a symbol, a spiral with 3 lines radiating from the center, the mark on Pathfinder's flank. Nima's strength returned slowly, a tide coming in almost too gently to perceive, but with each passing day, she was a little more present, her eyes holding more light. The drawing on the pine bark was the beginning of their true communication. She would draw, and he would watch, and slowly a story began to unfold, sketched in charcoal and silence. She drew the spiral symbol again, larger this time. Then she pointed to Pathfinder, visible through the open cabin door, and then back to the drawing. She tapped her own chest. The symbol belonged to the horse, but it also belonged to her. It was the mark of her people. She drew a mountain range, far more jagged and imposing than the ones surrounding them, and then a series of winding lines leading to a hidden valley. In the valley, she drew lodges, smoke rising from them, and figures of people. It was a map, not of terrain, but of memory. A map to a home he couldn't see. Over several evenings, by the flickering firelight, the story grew. Her people were the Apsaluke, a band he knew only through rumor as the Sky Reachers, a reclusive tribe that was said to have vanished from these mountains a generation ago. They had not vanished. They had hidden. The valley she drew was their last sanctuary, a place so well concealed by the canyons and peaks that outsiders could never find it. But their survival depended on a special breed of horse, the ones that bore the spiral mark. These were not war ponies or hunting mounts. They were pathfinders. They possessed an innate, almost mystical ability to navigate the treacherous high country, to find hidden passages and safe routes even in the most blinding blizzards. They were living keys, each one bonded to a keeper. Nima was a keeper. Pathfinder was her horse. They had been separated from their people during a journey to sacred hunting grounds when a surprise patrol of soldiers had scattered them. Nima had been shot, her leg shattered, and in the chaos, she and Pathfinder had fled, traveling for days until she finally collapsed by the creek where Silas had found her. The mare had not been merely following him out of loyalty. She had been protecting the keeper of her sacred trust, waiting for her to heal, to finish the journey home. The weight of this revelation settled on Silas, heavy and profound. He looked at the scrawny, dusty mare grazing in the meadow and saw her for what she was. Not a stray, but a vessel of hope, the last thread connecting a woman to her lost people. He looked at Nima, no longer a wounded stranger, but the keeper of a sacred duty. and he looked at his own calloused hands, the hands of a failed rancher, and understood his role in this story. He was the temporary guardian, the steward of this fragile hope. He had come to this worthless piece of land to disappear, to become nothing. Instead, he had stumbled into the heart of a story far older and more important than his own. His small cabin was no longer a refuge from failure, but a waypoint on a vital journey. The knowledge changed everything. The wind whistling through the pines no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like it was whispering ancient names. The mountains were no longer a barrier. They were a fortress, guarding a secret he was now a part of. That night, he felt a peace he hadn't known since he was a boy. His life had been stripped down to the essentials: fire, shelter, and the quiet duty of care. He had nothing, yet he felt richer than Jedediah Thorne with all his land and cattle. He had been given a trust. He resolved, in the quiet of his own heart, that he would not fail it. The first snows came early that year, a fine dusting of white that clung to the high peaks and turned the meadow silver in the mornings. It was a warning. The window for travel was closing. Nima was growing stronger, now able to walk with the aid of a crude crutch Silas had fashioned for her, but she was not yet ready for a hard journey. A sense of urgency settled over the small cabin. Silas worked harder than ever, stockpiling firewood, smoking the meat from a deer he managed to hunt, and reinforcing the cabin against the coming winter. He felt a deep, primal need to protect them, to see this through to its end. The crisis came not from the cold, but from a man. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing one afternoon, stumbling through the snow, calling out weakly. It was Jedediah Thorne. His face was blue with cold, his fine coat torn, one arm hanging uselessly at his side. He'd been hunting, he explained through chattering teeth, got caught in a sudden squall, fell, and dislocated his shoulder. He was lost, freezing, and on the verge of collapse. Silas looked at the man who had mocked him, who had taken his home and saw only a human being in desperate need. Without a word, he helped Thorne inside, sat him by the fire, and gave him hot broth. Nima watched from her corner, her dark eyes unreadable. Silas, using knowledge passed down from his father, gritted his teeth and shoved Thorne's shoulder back into its socket. The man roared in pain, then slumped in relief, exhausted. He was trapped with them. That night, the squall turned into a full-blown blizzard. Wind howled around the cabin, and snow piled in deep drifts against the door. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, and inside their tiny sanctuary, another crisis was brewing. The shock and the cold sent Nima into a relapse. Her fever returned with a vengeance, fiercer than before. She became delirious, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Silas knew she wouldn't survive without medicine, without the doctor in Redemption Gulch. But the trail was impassable. 40 miles in this blizzard was a death sentence. Thorne, huddled by the fire, watched with a dawning horror. "She's not going to make it," he muttered. "None of us are." Despair settled in the small room, thick and suffocating. But then Silas looked outside. Pathfinder was standing near the cabin, her body turned into the wind, her coat thick with snow. She was restless, pawing at the ground, her eyes fixed on the trail leading down the mountain. She looked at Silas, and a strange, clear understanding passed between them. She knew she could make the journey. It was a mad gamble, a fool's hope, but it was the only one they had. "I'm going," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. Thorne stared at him as if he were insane. "You'll die out there." "Maybe," Silas replied, pulling on his heaviest clothes. "But she'll die if I stay." He went outside, the wind tearing at him. He didn't saddle Pathfinder. There was no time. He simply took hold of her mane. "Take me," he whispered into her ear. "Take me down the mountain." The mare seemed to understand. She turned and plunged into the blinding white, and Silas held on, trusting the impossible horse to lead him through the storm. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and snow. Silas couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, the howling gale stealing the breath from his lungs and stinging his face with ice. He clung to Pathfinder's mane, his head bowed against the onslaught, surrendering his fate to the animal's instinct. The mare did not hesitate. She moved with a confidence that defied the storm, not along the trail he knew, but through a landscape he didn't recognize. She navigated dense thickets of pine that broke the wind, descended into sheltered ravines where the snow was shallower, and picked her way across frozen streams with an uncanny certainty. She was not fighting the blizzard. She was flowing with it, using the terrain as a shield. It was a route no man could have found, a secret path known only to her bloodline. Hours blurred into a single, desperate struggle for survival. Silas lost all sense of time and direction, his world reduced to the warmth of the horse's body beneath him and the relentless motion forward. Just when he thought his frozen limbs would give out, that he would fall and be swallowed by the snow, the wind began to lessen. Lights twinkled ahead. Redemption Gulch. They had made it. The journey that had taken him 2 days on foot had taken the mare less than half a night. He slid from her back, his legs buckling, and stumbled toward the doctor's house, Pathfinder following close behind. He hammered on the door until a light appeared. Dr. Adams, a kind, weary man, took one look at Silas's frost-rimmed face and knew it was a matter of life and death. He gathered medicine for the fever, bandages, and a bottle of laudanum, his movements quick and efficient. "The trail is impassable," the doctor said, shaking his head in disbelief. "How did you get through?" Silas just looked at the mare standing silently in the street, steam rising from her coat. "She showed me the way." The return journey was just as harrowing, but now Silas was armed with medicine and a renewed sliver of hope. Pathfinder retraced her steps through the blizzard with the same unerring precision. When they finally stumbled back into the clearing, the first gray light of dawn was breaking. The cabin was a small, snow-covered mound, a single thread of smoke rising from its chimney. Inside, Thorn looked up, his face a mask of astonishment. He had been certain he was watching a dead man walk out the door. Silas administered the medicine to Nima, his hands steady despite his exhaustion. He sat by her side, bathing her face with snowmelt, watching and waiting. Thorn was silent, a witness to this quiet, desperate battle. He watched the man he'd scorned risk his life for a stranger. He watched as Silas tended to the woman with a gentle reverence. The town's mockery, his own cruel words, echoed in his mind, sounding hollow and shameful in the face of such raw courage. By nightfall, Nima's fever broke. Her breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, healing sleep. The blizzard blew itself out, leaving behind a world of profound silence and immaculate white. In the quiet of the cabin, something had irrevocably shifted. The walls no longer held just 3 strangers. They held a shared ordeal, a testament to an impossible journey. Jedediah Thorne, the powerful rancher, looked at Silas Croft, the broken outcast, and saw not a failure, but a man of a caliber he had never known. The community of the valley was no longer just the town below. It was here, in this tiny cabin, forged in a crucible of snow and fire. When the snows finally melted enough for travel, Jedediah Thorne was the first to leave. He was a different man from the one who had stumbled into the clearing. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, humbled respect. He shook Silas's hand, his grip firm. "Croft," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I owe you my life." He looked at Nema, now sitting up and clear-eyed, and nodded his head to her. "And I was wrong about everything." He rode away without looking back, but Silas knew the story of that night would be told. And it was. Thorne arrived in Redemption Gulch and went straight to the saloon. But he didn't go to drink and brag. He went to the center of the room and told them all what he had seen. He told them about Silas Croft's courage, about the impossible journey through the blizzard, and about the horse that was more than a horse. He spoke of the quiet dignity in that remote cabin, and of his own shame. The townspeople, who had been so quick to mock and dismiss, listened in stunned silence. The laughter was gone, replaced by a murmur of awe. The narrative of Silas Croft, the failure, was being rewritten. A week later, Dr. Adams rode up to the cabin, ostensibly to check on his patient. He found Nema walking in the meadow, her limp barely noticeable, and Silas repairing a fence line, Anchor standing patiently by his side. The doctor examined Nema, pronounced her recovery a miracle, and shared a flask of coffee with Silas. "The town is talking," Dr. Adams said, his eyes twinkling. "They're calling you the guardian of the high meadow. Thorne has made you into a local legend." Silas just shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. He had done what anyone should have done. But the doctor's visit was a quiet confirmation. The outside world now saw what he had discovered in his solitude, that value wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in character. Spring arrived in the high country, painting the meadow with wildflowers. And with the spring, they came. One morning, Nema pointed to the far ridge. A small party of riders sat on their horses, still and watchful. Her people, the Sky Reachers. They had been searching since the snows cleared, following faint signs, hoping against hope. Nema walked out to meet them, and the reunion was a thing of quiet, profound emotion. There were no loud cries, only hands clasped and tears shed in silence. Their leader, a tall, dignified man with streaks of gray in his hair, approached Silas. He spoke some English, learned long ago. He thanked Silas for saving one of their most beloved keepers. He offered payment: furs, horses, silver. Silas politely refused. "There is no debt," he said simply. "I was just a neighbor." The leader looked at him, his gaze deep and searching. He understood. He looked at Pathfinder, who stood near Silas, and then back to Nema. A silent conversation passed between them. The vindication was complete. It hadn't come from proving Thorne wrong, but from being true to himself. The town that had cast him out now looked upon him with reverence. The people he had helped now stood before him as friends. He had sought isolation and found community in the most unexpected of ways. The Sky Reachers stayed for 3 days, their small camp a respectful distance from the cabin. They shared food with Silas, and through their leader they shared stories. They told him of the hidden valley, of their history, and of the sacred bond with the Pathfinder horses. On the morning of their departure, Nema came to him. She was dressed in fine, new buckskins, her hair braided with beads. She looked like the keeper she was meant to be. She stood before him, her hand resting on Pathfinder's neck. "She stays with you," Nema said. Her English soft but clear. Silas was stunned. "I can't. She is yours." She has to take you home." Nima smiled, a sad but beautiful expression. "Her journey with me is over. She chose you in the storm. Her path is here now, a gift." She placed the mare's lead rope in his hand, then pressed her palm to his chest in a gesture of farewell. "You have a strong heart, Silas Croft. Our people will not forget." He watched them ride away, a small, proud band disappearing back into the vastness of the mountains, until they were just specks against the horizon. He was alone again, but he was not lonely. He turned and looked at the mare. Pathfinder nudged his shoulder with her head, a gesture of quiet affirmation. She had stayed. The seasons turned. The story of Silas Croft and the spirit horse of the high meadow became a fixture of the valley, told around campfires and in the saloon. People started making the journey up to his homestead, not out of idle curiosity, but to offer a respectful greeting, to trade goods, or simply to be in the presence of the quiet man and his remarkable horse. He never sought them out, but he never turned them away. He had found his place, not on a deed, but in the esteem of others and in the stewardship of his small piece of land. The final scene unfolds at golden hour, months later. The cabin is sturdy and whole, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. A small, well-tended garden grows by its side. Silas stands at the edge of his meadow, looking out over the canyon as the setting sun paints the clouds in hues of amber and rose. Anchor grazes peacefully nearby. Pathfinder walks up and stands beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. The silence between them is comfortable, complete. He had lost a ranch, a legacy of ownership passed down from his father. But here, in this place everyone called worthless, he had found something infinitely more valuable. He puts a hand on the mare's strong neck, feeling the life, the spirit, within. "Some men look for a place to own," he says quietly, to the horse, to the sky, to himself. "All I ever needed was a place to belong. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this journey. It's a powerful reminder that true wealth is found in the courage of the heart." If this story of quiet strength moved you, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales like this one. Let us know in the comments what part of Silas's story resonated with you the most. We'll be back soon with another story of the forgotten heroes of the frontier.